The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Weathering the Storm, How Your Nonprofit Can Build a Viable Disaster Recovery Plan Using the Cloud. My name is Paige Miller, Marketing and Business Development Manager here at AK Enterprise Solutions, and I'll be moderating the presentation. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping notes. Close any programs running other than GoToWebinar. Use one monitor for the webinar. If you experience visual or audio issues, please contact GoTo at support.logmeinc.com/GoToWebinar/contact us. Lastly, if you have any issues, don't worry. This webinar is being recorded and we'll send you the recording in the next few business days. Also, I wanted to point out the questions pane of the control panel in the upper right corner of your screen. Using this functionality, you may submit questions at any time during the presentation. We'll address as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the call. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you after the presentation. Today's session will be presented by Greg Inks, Cloud Practice Lead at AKA Enterprise Solutions. Greg has been with AKA for almost 2 years, but has spent over 2 decades specializing in Microsoft and Azure platforms. Outside of work, Greg is a true Renaissance man. He enjoys making everything from furniture, soap, computers, and cars by hand. And now I'd like to hand it off to Greg Inks. Greg?
Thanks, Petra. Great introduction. Much appreciated. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on the webinar. Wanted to spend a little bit of time setting up some of the topics that we're going to cover today during the agenda for this webinar, and talk through a few things that you should probably keep in the back of your mind while we're going through these topics. The first thing you should be thinking about and asking yourself is, why is a disaster recovery plan really essential for the survival of your nonprofit? What would be the implications to your organization should a disaster event happen and your systems be knocked out or your organization be unavailable for the end users you're trying to serve? What are some of the considerations for determining what a good disaster recovery plan is for you? There's many different types of disasters that we need to protect against, and depending upon what that type of disaster is, may necessitate a small or large investment in infrastructure and IT facilities to be able to weather that storm and take care of and handle that disaster. How affordable is your disaster recovery plan really depends on how you've implemented it and what type of scenarios you're trying to protect against. And if you look to solutions that happen to run in the cloud, sometimes that affordability is vastly different than what it would have been if it were done on-premise using traditional means. And last but not least, one of the discussion topics we're going to spend a little bit of time on is best practices and what you should use and think about when you're evaluating your disaster recovery options and what works best for you. So disasters in general, they're easy to avoid, right? We all think about disaster scenarios when it comes to weather events and geopolitical type of things, but if you ever actually taken a step back and thought about what disasters mean to individuals beyond just your organization, but the actual individuals, employees, and people you're trying to serve, or what does disasters do to an entire country where you're doing business and operating, and think through the different implications of what that type of a disaster may be. For individuals, disasters can come in all kinds of different flavors, from those things that are accidental to those things that are malicious. An equipment theft or a loss in some scenarios could be as simple as I left my laptop somewhere. In other situations could be that it gets stolen out of the back of your vehicle. Well, what happens to your individual or to your organization should you lose a laptop? What about the data that it's stored? Is there any risk exposure for the type of data that was on that laptop? What do you do in that disaster scenario beyond just the security implications, but how do you weather the storm for something as simple as a laptop theft? Or if we think about it from a more targeted scenario, many organizations and individuals today are being targeted with malware, spam, bad websites. While most of those considerations are typically thought of in security circles, very few organizations actually evaluate the impact to their operations if that particular individual is offline. If it's just a developer that happens to be a member of your team, that may not be that big of an impact or a disaster for your organization, but it could be a very large disaster for that individual. On the other hand, if that individual happens to be a board level director or even your CEO, what happens if they're offline and their email's compromised? What type of a disaster do you have on your hands at that point? Organizations, on the other hand, it's a little bit easier for us to wrap our heads around what disasters are from an organization perspective, especially when we talk about brick and mortar. As being here in the North Carolinas, with recent events of the hurricanes and the snowstorms that have happened lately, there's been a lot of focused attention here in the Carolinas around how to protect our infrastructure from disaster in the form of natural disasters. If your employees can't get to your physical building to actually perform their duties, is your organization impacted? Or worse yet, if your physical location has been taken offline, either due to power failure, network failure, or worse comes to worse, destruction from a fire or a flood, what does your organization do? Can you weather that type of event? Countries, on the other hand, is something we should also consider, because in today's geopolitical climate, a lot of implications that are outside of our control come from at the country level. If you think about it, natural disasters can be larger than just a regionally based type of disaster. Earthquakes happen on the West Coast. What if a major earthquake happens on the West Coast and has a major event that goes up and down the coastline? Can your organization survive that? Or finally, if you're in a location where there's a lot of geopolitical unrest, maybe there's some protests that are going on that involve your government or something along those lines, what do you do for your organization if the infrastructure is disrupted, or your employees or your people that you're trying to serve can't get to your services? So the list can go on from disasters, from something as simple as an act of God to something that is very intentional, mischievous, or malicious. And whether or not you have the security in place to protect yourself against it, it's still a disaster that you need to prepare for. So ask yourself, can your nonprofit systems really survive or rather, could your organization survive if your nonprofit systems weren't available to your employees for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, a day, a week? What's the impact to your organization? If your folks can't get to the telephones and they can't answer their email, what's the impact to your overall approach and your mission that you're trying to serve? If you have a laptop that's lost by an employee, what's your risk exposure? What happens to the not profitability, but the operational capability of your organization due to data theft or data loss? What about the individual? What happens to their productivity while they're waiting and trying to figure out what to do about the loss of their laptop? What about any of the documents or any of the reports that they were working on that were lost as part of that event? Is that productivity of that individual something that you're concerned about? What happens if it happens in mass? What about power failures? If your power goes out in your data center, do you have a fallback? It's very easy to say, sure, we've got a fallback. We've got another server sitting in the other room in a different floor. But if you lose power to the entire building and all of your systems are co-located, you're pretty much in trouble, and you have no real backup at that point. So as you can start to think through this, these are scenarios around, just things happen, accidents, scenarios where, power outages. But then there's also bad actors, people that are intentionally trying to sabotage you, that are trying to disrupt your mission. What if you go through a denial of service attack? What if somebody is trying to bring down your website? Is that website critical for you? What do you do if your database has been corrupted and somebody got in and either stole all your data, or worse yet, took it offline, disrupted the data, crippled it? What's your business continuity plan? Can you continue to operate without those systems? Last but not least, if the hurricane really does hit and your building is destroyed, what happens to all the people that are depending upon you, both the employees and the people that you're trying to serve with your mission? What do you do in that scenario? So while some of these things may seem a little over the top and a little unrealistic, the situations are true and they are real, and they're happening to nonprofits on a regular basis. So the real thing that you should do is start to consider, what is your initial plan? What do you have in place today? What have you started to think about? If you haven't, I would encourage you to start with the very beginning and start doing some pre-planning. The best defense to protect yourself against this is really starting to prepare. Work with your C-suite, your CISOs, your CIOs, your CTOs, and review your security posture. Really thinking about things from a security standpoint starts the ball rolling when you're trying to decide what do you do in disaster scenarios. So while this presentation is not largely focused on security, it's a good way to start getting those thought processes going, because most IT organizations can really relate to a security type of threat and how to mitigate against that security threat. Natural disaster or disaster recovery scenario is not tremendously different. Consider your individuals. Their security is your frontline defense. If you have individuals that are sharing usernames and passwords, chances are your individual security is fairly light and your risk exposure is high. You're inviting disaster to happen to both the individual and your organization. Take a look at things like two-factor authentication, your virus protection, your firewalls, your laptop authorizations. Make sure that people have the tools and the protection that they need where they're at when they're using those tools. Conduct a very brief security and safety preparedness training for all your employees. Teach them about the risks that they have, the power that they have, the vulnerability that they're exposing, and walk through some scenarios for simple ways that they can protect themselves. Taking a laptop and locking it in the trunk of a vehicle is a lot safer than leaving it on the back seat of a locked vehicle. You help mitigate some risk by just keeping that disaster from happening. Certainly keeping the laptop with you and not leaving in the vehicle is the safest, but you start to understand that there are degrees of protection that you need to evaluate. The other big thing that I always tell a lot of the folks that I talk to, a lot of the C-suites, is you got to unemotionally and realistically evaluate your exposure and think about things in terms of what is the real net impact. Most organizations would say that their website is crucial and critical to their operations. And I've often heard CIOs say, I need at least 99.9% uptime. Well, what does that practically mean? That means that I can't incur more than 9 hours worth of blackout per year or being offline per year. That's a pretty strict SLA, 9 hours of downtime. Now, granted, you can't control when that happens. That means that you're virtually running almost the entire year with a very small window of blackout. For many organizations, that's plenty. For some organizations that are really mission critical and need to be available at a moment's notice in any given situation, 99.9 is not enough. What if you drop your laptop? How much will it cost for a data scientist or a forensics expert to recover the data on your laptop? Is the data on that laptop that critical for you as an individual or your organization? Could you have done things to protect that data so that the loss of the physical drive on that machine was not business critical? What is that disaster scenario that you're trying to mitigate against? Assuming that you've done some level of protection, what else can you do when disaster strikes? Let's focus on some realistic scenarios. So we've got a lot of different disaster recovery options. Let's start off by talking through a few of them for an individual. What can we do as individuals to help mitigate some risks? So there's a lot of options that Microsoft has at your disposal that can help mitigate disasters before they even occur. One could be as simple as implementing a container service for your endpoint devices. For those of you that aren't familiar with what that means, most of us do have some form of a smartphone or a tablet or an e-reader where we're doing some degree of work on them. By implementing a container service like Microsoft Intune, we as an organization can protect our employees by making sure that the data that's on those smart devices stays inside of that container. In the event that the individual loses that device, an administrator for your organization can remote wipe that device or remove all the data from the container. Or to the further extreme, require separate access controls for the container on the smart device. If I use my cell phone and I pick up my Microsoft Outlook running on my iPhone, I get prompted for credentials, my fingerprint or my face recognition or a passcode to just get into the phone, but then a second passcode or a second set of fingerprints or a second set of facial recognition to get into Outlook. So that form of extra security helps my organization feel confident that the container is protecting the data that's inside of it. The other thing, there's other things that you can do at the laptop level. If you've got a laptop that you do a lot of reports and presentations, spreadsheets, Word docs, who doesn't have tons of material like that? And you're worried about what happens if I lose my laptop, implement technology like Microsoft OneDrive. That will ensure that all of the data that's on your laptop is backed up to the cloud. So said differently, should I drop that laptop and shatter the hard drive, I don't have to worry about it because everything that I was working on was backed up to the cloud, and I can pick up where I left off from another device that is authorized to access the cloud to get at that data. Last but not least, if you have teams that are collaborating on data, make sure that they're all collaborating in a safe and secured way using a product like Microsoft SharePoint or Microsoft Teams. It's real easy for some organizations to say, oh, don't worry about that, we'll just load it up into Google Docs. Okay, but now does your organization have control over that? Do they have the ability to help you should something get corrupted? Do they have the ability to audit and detect whether or not a hack attempt or a data breach occurred when it's not stored in something that they have access rights to? While it may seem a little bit big brother, in a lot of ways, you're actually protecting your employees and your assets by implementing this type of technology. Additionally, encourage your people to realize that, password or password changes, they may be, somewhat troublesome and annoying, and remembering what that password is can be a little bit of a human problem. But on the other hand, we have ways to make it so that it's easier for an organization and individual to not have to necessarily remember their complicated passwords, and maybe release a little bit of the scrutiny on the password by implementing multi-factor. So in other words, I have a physical app that runs on my phone, or a text message that gets sent to me anytime I try to access my Azure Active Directory. I use both my username and password, my credentials to get in. My credential is probably not as strong as it could be. I could probably make it stronger. I probably should make it stronger, but I don't have to worry as much because I also have two-factor authentication turned on that's going to change my physical code that I have to enter and alter that code every 30 to 60 seconds. So in other words, I have to have three pieces of information to be able to get in. Password that I have and that I know who I am with my credentials, and a phone or a device or some way to get yet another code to be able to enter it. That helps with keeping us secure and safe as individuals, and make sure that we don't lose our assets and our IP as an organization. Last but not least, email. We all know it, we all love it, we all use it, we all have way too much of it. Office 365 has backup solutions in place for controlling all of your email. So while we're talking about backups, that helps you protect against the disaster of losing your Exchange server on-premise by putting it in the cloud. Microsoft takes the ownership of making sure that you never get your email lost and that it never loses anything. So should Microsoft lose a data center, that data has been stored in multiple locations, and you don't have to worry about that data disappearing because they've got it in other locations to be able to restore to. In essence, it's a turnkey solution. You never have to worry about losing your data. But they also have tools in there for email and spam protection. One of the biggest attack vectors that we're seeing these days is coming through email with what would seem to be a company email from employee to employee or organization to organization asking for somebody to go do a task. And if you're not really careful, that email address, while it looks like it came from your CEO, actually came from somebody else. Should you click on that link? Should you follow the instructions to, hey, can you open up that document and send it to me? Sometimes those are coming through as a bad attack vector and compromise our security and make us vulnerable to certain types of attack. So these are some pretty simple ways that you can take care of this for individuals. By leveraging these tools from Microsoft, we can do some pretty simple math to figure out what's the best way to secure us and how expensive is it going to look like. Plans for Microsoft are all priced per individual and per service. So you can pick and choose the right combination of things that you need to protect your resources without worrying about an overkill. Does every single person in the entire organization need the nth degree of security protection? Probably not, but you probably have a board of directors that you're really concerned about. So why not make sure that we've got the right endpoint protection in place for them versus individuals that are just developers that are maybe sending a lot of email but aren't necessarily exposing sensitive data or pose a disaster event scenario. Maybe we don't need to go with such a high degree of awareness or protection for them. Whatever the situation is for you, licensing becomes a subscription. It goes up and down with your needs. So as people's roles change, you move up and down the spectrum and adjust as you need. So in this example, let's say we have a nonprofit that has 100 employees. Most of those employees need some form of email, some form of protection for their smartphones, some form of protection for their desktops. So we'll look at an Office 365 product that runs averagely about $3 to $4 per person per month and includes all of the software downloads to run on 5 devices. Point to note, this is non-for-profit pricing, and it's subject to change. So you need to talk with Microsoft or with AK to get the latest and greatest prices, but for illustration purposes, these are pretty accurate. Then for those individuals that we're really concerned about their threat protection, we can add on Microsoft Intune, which can get us as low as under $1 per person per month, and make sure that they're fully protected. If we did this scenario across every single employee for the 100 employees for this nonprofit, everything's disaster recovery backed up, users are protected, email secured, documents are located and co-located in SharePoint and in OneDrive, and all of those devices are operating containers. For that simple type of solution, for about $300 to $400 per month, you've now mitigated almost all of the different disaster risks that you could for individuals, and we haven't even gotten into specific scenarios that maybe your nonprofit is specifically worried about. So that's an example of things that we can do for individuals. Now, in terms of organizations, some of these scenarios will be a little bit easier to understand for the IT audiences that are watching this webinar. And for those of you that are more business-centric, I'll try to keep these in terms that everybody can understand. But from an IT point of view, everything that we do when we make recommendations to our customers revolves around the concept of risk versus cost. Or said differently, what is the disaster scenario that we're trying to do, and how do we put it into quantifiable terms versus the cost that it's going to take to go and achieve that type of solution? Most people in IT scenarios refer to RTO and RPO. RTO is recovery time objective. It's the amount of time you would need until your systems come back up and online. So in other words, how long can I survive without my system before I'm in real trouble? So if it was a website, how long can that website stay offline? If it was a CRM system, how long can I survive without having access to my customer records? If it's a financial system, how long can I operate my finances in my company without having the latest and greatest financial information? Recovery point objective, on the other hand, or RPO, is what is the amount of data loss I can suffer through without having a major consequence for my organization? Can I lose 5 minutes worth of data and still recover? Can I lose 5 days worth of data and still recover? What type of backup threshold do I need to have in place to be able to make sure I know what I can do and what I can survive? Depending upon those types of answers to those questions really drives out what your DR solution looks like. The smaller the RTO, the more of a high availability solution you need, and that drives cost quite fast. A high availability means I have to have multiple sites running concurrently, multiple servers concurrently, and depending upon how much of a risk I have from a disaster scenario, it could exponentially grow quite quickly. So from a website perspective, maybe I need to have 2 servers versus 1. Maybe I need to have 1 server in one location, 1 server in another. Those types of scenarios come in the smaller the RTO goes. On the other hand, the smaller the RPO means the more aggressive I have to be in backup schedules. How do I make sure that my data is backed up and secured in a location where I can prevent loss? You know, the lower the RPO means the less data I can lose. If I'm in a banking scenario with banking transactions, most financial institutions would say, I can't afford to lose a single record, in which case we have to have real-time backups that are happening on a transactional level in multiple locations to make sure we have 0 data loss. On the other hand, some organizations say, you know what, I can recover 5 minutes worth of data or 10 minutes worth of data because we've got secondary systems that originally sourced it. I'm not that worried about it, so I can release some constraints on RPO. So when we take these 2 factors into consideration and we combine that with the power of the cloud, we start to say, all right, well, what do we have for options? You know, Microsoft Azure is a cloud-based solution. It's Microsoft's offering for virtualized infrastructure, for platform as a service and software as a service, and it covers more than just Microsoft technology. So if you happen to be an organization that is very open source friendly and taking advantage of a lot of open source technologies, the cloud is still a great place for you to go and look towards for disaster recovery. Azure is going to have your back with Linux and Red Hat because they're both first-class citizens on the Azure platform. So this is not just a conversation about Microsoft or Microsoft Tech anymore. It's about how do we continue to have business continuity? How do we make sure that your organization can survive these disasters? Let's talk through a couple real-world examples leveraging Azure. So in this scenario, we have a nonprofit that has an on-premise data center. This data center is a fairly decent-sized data center, but nothing too big. They've got an RTO of about 60 minutes, which means they can survive with their data center being offline for about an hour. So that means that they've got a lot of business processes in place, and they're not highly technologically dependent, but they do have some dependencies. On the other hand, they can't afford to lose more than 20 minutes worth of data. In other words, if they happen to have a failure of a system and they go more than 20 minutes, they don't have the ability to recover from that. They want a solution. They got to figure out a way to weather the next hurricane. They can't afford for a hurricane to take them out and offline for more than an hour, and they're looking for recommendations around what can they do at an entire data center level or a data center perspective. So they have concerns about power failure. They have concerns about internet connectivity. They recently had a loss of power for 2 days, and it crippled them. They were offline and they couldn't do what it was that their mission had. But they're not a large nonprofit, and they can't afford to duplicate their entire data center. That's a very costly solution to this type of problem, and going after and building a secondary data center is just not going to work. So if we kind of think about what would be a potential solution for this scenario, we can look at building a secondary disaster recovery site in Azure as virtualized infrastructure. We can leverage some of the Azure technology like Azure Site Recovery to real-time replicate their entire infrastructure, their data, their disks, their hardware, their virtual machines up into the cloud, but bring it up there in an offline state. So in other words, replicate their entire data center inside of Azure, bringing all the data up, but leaving everything offline. It's a data center that's dormant. What does that mean? Well, it means that we've got a certain amount of setup costs and monthly costs that we need to consider for this. Setup costs is a one-time thing. I've got to go and create the virtual networking. I've got to set up all the hybrid connections so that I can replicate my data centers. I've got to set up the Azure technology, some of the automation and runbook. That's all the nuts and bolts. We set that up once, we're done, we forget about it. From a monthly perspective, however, though, this is where it gets really compelling. From a secondary disaster recovery site, really the only costs that we have are related to the humans that are manning it and paying attention to that infrastructure, and the storage of the data that happens to be running up in Azure. So in this scenario, 10 servers, about 10 terabytes worth of data, that takes us up around $400 a month, add in a little bit of the replication technology. For about $650 a month, this nonprofit could have a full backup replica of their entire data center sitting up there in the cloud, up in Azure, as a backup insurance policy. So if they happen to experience another power outage, or worse yet, a hurricane comes and knocks them offline for a couple of days, that all they have to do is fail over to their Azure instance, bring all that hardware online, and then run their solution, run their systems, run their data centers in the cloud, not really missing a beat and keeping everything up and running. So $650 for a secondary data center sounds like a pretty good solution. In this scenario, we're going to talk a little bit about a highly valuable database. So forget about the full data center. We're not worried about that in this situation. This organization, they've got most things under control. RTO is really not that important. They have other solutions to keep their systems up and running. But what they're really concerned about is data loss. For whatever reason, this data loss is really concerning to them. The system can go down, they can continue to work, but if they lose any data, it becomes a real big deal to their mission and potentially disrupts their entire goals of what they're trying to operate on. The database size is pretty large. We're talking about a 20 terabyte database. So traditional solutions make duplicating this not necessarily a viable option. And especially if you keep it in the same on-premise location, they're not really solving for a disaster recovery problem. So they need a way to store 20 terabytes worth of a database somewhere else. And the organization probably also has more than just this database. They've got some files that are very critical for their operations, probably contracts, charters, historical information, things of that. Regardless of the scenario, it's a data problem. We need data backed up into the cloud. How can we do that? So a potential solution for this would be to look at a couple of different things. First, a secondary disaster recovery storage site in Azure, running in what we call platform as a service. This is where we don't necessarily need to stand up a whole suite of infrastructure, but rather we leverage the platform as a service capabilities of Azure to take care of storage. We can leverage Azure storage services, which are storage accounts running as platform as a service, and we can push the SQL data up there as blob storage. Now, it's not a full running database, but it's a backup. We got a copy of that data sitting up inside of a storage account that should we ever get worried about, we need to go back and get some more of that data or find it and recover from it. It's set up there in a storage account that we can go get access to on a moment's notice, go get that data. It's been backed up. We've got copies of everything. We can do the same thing with files. We talked a little bit about using SharePoint. I still always recommend going down that path, going to a more document-friendly solution. But maybe this is just a set of legacy documents, and we're trying to back up a a file system. We can use storage accounts to back up a file system. We can do it into file storage or blob storage, depending upon the requirements and the network needs, and really back up all of that 20 terabytes worth of data into the cloud. There's still a little bit of setup costs. We got to set up some virtual networking to make sure all those pipes work and all the connectivity is there, setting up the storage accounts and making sure that they've been done in a secured way to protect you. But really, the monthly run costs are just in terms of running Azure and paying for the storage. So if really we're talking about backing up all of this data and having a backup copy everywhere, for this type of disaster scenario, for $400 a month, you can be very, very comfortable that your data has been taken care of and is in a location that's readily available for others. This last scenario that I wanted to kind of talk through is one that will probably hit for a lot of folks. We got a mission critical website. You know, this website is really our bread and butter as this nonprofit, and it's mission critical in that it's both for our beneficiaries as well as our employees. Everybody uses this website. It's the primary vehicle of communication. Any downtime of the site means potentially not able to serve my mission and maybe even loss of life. So in that scenario, that makes you start to kind of go, well, then it's got to be up, and it's got to be up at all times. This organization has their website hosted in a data center in Virginia, not unlike most organizations have some sort of on-premise data center. That location has also been recently hit with bad weather events, with hurricanes, with flooding. You know, Virginia tends to be the same as the Carolinas. When it comes to a bad weather event, we get in all kinds of trouble. Well, they're looking for a solution that is geographically protected. They don't want to have to worry about what happens in the Virginias anymore, what happens on the East Coast. They want to make sure that they have a solution that can weather it in a much more geographically dispersed way and keep an uptime that's at least 99.9%, ideally even higher, because in their minds, this is a mission critical site. They can't afford for this to ever be down, so less than 5 minutes of RTO. They can't afford to lose any data, less than 5 minutes of RPO. This organization can't afford to go build a whole new data center just for a website. It's cost prohibitive. So they have to look to the cloud to help try to solve some of these types of performance problems. So what can we do about that? Well, a potential solution would be to get them out of brick and mortar, move them out of brick and mortar entirely, or at least augment that with some additional data service capabilities of Azure. Azure has what's called an application service, or it's a platform as a service capability for hosting websites. We can put a copy of that website into an app service and run it in, say, East US. And if you're saying, well, we have a PHP website, that's not going to work, don't worry about it. PaaS services support many different flavors of technology, from Microsoft's .NET to PHP to Java to open source technologies. We can even do Docker containers. So if you've got a container or know how to take a website and all of its respective pieces and put it into a container, we can load that up into an app service. We'll create a secondary one, maybe on the West Coast. So now we've got our Virginia data center, we've got a copy of the website running in Azure in East US, a copy running in West US. We can set up a load balancer to distribute traffic across all of those different locations. So should one of them fail, we can reroute traffic to all the others and eliminate that node so that we don't have any failures and failure for hitting the website. We can also look at using a product like Azure CDN to do content delivery, help reduce the cost and the size of those footprints of those web servers by offloading some of the static content into a cache network. That'll also even give us the side benefit of increased performance. So for people that happen to be non-US based, they're going to see that the website is actually performing even faster than it was before because it's operating off of a CDN backbone rather than going all the way back to the web server. This is not that expensive to set up. Setting up this is really just configuring some app services and some load balancers, the CDN. Your monthly run costs, obviously this is going to be a little bit dependent upon how much traffic you're dealing with, could be as low as $200 a month, with a CDN as low as $150 a month. So depending upon how big your website is and how much traffic it's getting, for as low as $350 a month, you could have a full geographically dispersed website running in the cloud along with your on-premise and get close to that 99.9% uptime without having the fear of what happens if we have a bad hurricane. So hopefully those couple of scenarios have given you a little bit of a flavor for the types of things that we can do in the cloud. Granted, there's a million different disaster recovery scenarios, and these are just scratching the surface on some of the available options. But really, you've seen some of the pricing that I was just outlining around how a disaster recovery plan could look. How affordable is it really? In the previous example, I talked a little bit about individuals, and it's really not a joke when we say for less than $5 per person per month, you can have complete and total protection over all of your individuals and make sure that their devices are protected, their laptops are protected, their cell phones are protected. For organizations, the cloud is the perfect DR solution. You only pay for storage. You don't pay for compute if it's turned off. So if you don't need the DR site, leave it offline, don't run it. Just make sure your data is there so it's there in case of a rainy day, literally. A great alternative approach, and it's great alternative to the expensive investment, the hardware that some organizations oftentimes find themselves doing. The major debate of, do I go build another data center? Don't. You don't need to. Put it inside of the cloud, leave it there as your backup. Keep your investment in your existing on-premise stuff. If you've spent the time to go build those solutions, keep them there, but leverage the cloud to be your DR. Storage is cheap. Compute is free if you're not using it. And those mission critical systems can be set up to be a true insurance policy in the cloud. So those are some of the things that I really encourage you to think about when it's discussions around, is the cloud really an affordable solution for disaster recovery? So we have an offer for you. It would be poor form of me not to say that we've got some ideas here on how we can help you with this. Microsoft is investing in its partners and its customers to try to help organizations like yours get into the cloud and start to stand up some disaster recovery scenarios. This offer that we've got here is legit. Microsoft is going to help co-fund and co-invest in us along with AK for us to go and build these types of solutions for you. So once we've known, roughly what we're trying to do and how much we're trying to set up, this particular offer is an example scenario for what you could expect to see in terms of cost to go and design one of these types of solutions out with some co-investment coming from Microsoft. So we can do some workshops to go through and decide exactly what you need for a high availability or disaster recovery scenario. We can build each one of these DR setups per machine at a cost that's very manageable and estimatable. So what you see on the screen for about $800 a month, that's roughly what it would typically cost for us to go and set up one of these DR servers for you. Or you can see some of the database costs. But the point is, we would price this per VM, per SQL, and Microsoft is going to co-invest with us. If we can figure out exactly what your spend is going to be in Azure, let's say that you're going to spend about $150 a month in Azure, Microsoft is going to give the partner up to $5,000 to use on you to go deliver these services. So if you do the rough math on that, if we're talking about standing up 5 or so servers at about $1,000 a piece is about $5,000 to go build it. And that's probably going to generate anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 worth of Azure spend. In essence, you get your disaster recovery solution for free. Microsoft's going to pay for it, and all you have to worry about is your month-to-month run rate. So this deck will come out afterwards. You can have these numbers. These are legit. We're not bashful about it. And we really can help you come up with what's the real true costs are going to be. So from a next step point of view, how do you get started? Well, it's really, really simple. Call us. We'll give you a free conversation, a free discovery call. We'll spend an hour or two with you on the phone. We'll hear what your concerns are. We'll listen to what you're worried about, what risks you're trying to mitigate, and we'll see if we can come up with a logical fit for Azure. We'll try to do some rough back-of-the-envelope calculations. What's the cost going to look like? How big could it be? How much would it cost to go do that implementation? How much is the monthly run rate going to look like? Is this an affordable disaster recovery solution? And is it proportional to the risk that you're trying to mitigate? And if we come together and have this initial plan and you and AKA both feel that this is the right thing to go do, we'll engage Microsoft on your behalf or with you. Bring Microsoft into the mix. The three of us will sit down and figure out what makes the most sense. You saw that offer of what Microsoft is willing to co-invest in just doing disaster recovery scenarios, and that's just one of many, many different ways that Microsoft can help get you into the cloud. They've got opportunities to talk to you about reduced Azure credits to give you some free Azure so that you can try some of these DR scenarios and see how it fits. They've got incentives for partners to help build more of this for you. We'll spend the time with you to go up and come up with what that plan looks like and what the costs are. And once we both agree that this is the right thing to do, AKA and Microsoft will help get you that disaster recovery solution. We'll get it in place for you. The power of both companies coming together at the same time to try to make right what we need to keep you protected from the next disaster event. So with that, I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar and you learned a little bit here. Granted, this is a pretty broad topic and there's a lot of material and a lot of scenarios to try to walk through and cover. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions post this type of an event, so feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. But if there's any on the line, I'm happy to take some now.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. As Greg said, we'd love to take any questions you might have on the line now. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions to the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So we'll just hold for a minute for any questions. Again, you can use the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Just open the questions pane and type your question in and hit enter. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, and that's totally fine. If you think of anything that you would like to ask Greg, you can reach out to him directly. It's GINKS@akaes.com. It's right on the screen. Or you can reach out to me, Petra Eimiller. It's PEIMILLER @akes.com. Greg is the expert, however, so your best bet is to just reach out to him directly. That concludes today's presentation. Thank you again, Greg, and thank you everyone on the line for attending today's webinar, Weathering the Storm, How Your Nonprofit Can Build a Viable Disaster Recovery Plan Using the Cloud. You'll be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar in the next few business days. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very much.